Hey everybody, Alex from SCADA Forge here. Today we're going to go through the vision components that we need to go through the design challenge. Here in the designer we have our project opened up. We're going to go to the project browser, scroll down to the vision section. Here we have Ignition 102 vision components set up as a folder under Windows. In the tag browser you'll see we have a handful of tags set up to talk through the various components we're going to talk through in this video. And let's get into it. So first we're going to right click on the folder and create a new main window by selecting main window. We will give it a name. We'll call it Vision Display Components, because we're going to go through labels, numeric entry fields, and some multi-state buttons and indicators in this window. We'll hit create. That will create our window and open it up with just a root container in there. Down here below the tag browser, we see the Vision Property Editor. This will be for any components that we're looking at where we can configure the various properties on that component. The root container has some standard ones. We won't really mess with those in this video. And if we wanted to resize the window, we could either use the handles here in the window pane, or we could come down to, by selecting the window in the tree, we can come down to the properties and set the size. We'll just set that to 1140 by 760. And that gives us some space to use here. Now you'll see there's nothing on the window currently. To that we need to add some components. The first component that we'll look at is a label. If we look over here in the component palette, we see all the components that are available in Vision. You can scroll through that and see everything that's available. If for some reason you don't see a component palette, maybe you X'd it out at some point, you can go to View in the menu and Reset Panels, and that will take you back to a standard layout configuration, and you can adjust this however you want to. Typically I operate in a standard layout and may resize the tag browser and the property editor as needed. And again, if you were to say close these out and you don't see those, go back to the View menu, Reset Panels, and it'll take you back to your default state. So first, let's look at one of the simplest items available in Vision, which is a label. It's down here under Display. If you know what you're looking for, you can also type in here, and we'll see we have a label, a numeric label, and a linear scale available if we search for that. So to add this to the window, we will click on Label and drag over to our root container, and you'll see the icon turn into a plus there down below the cursor, and the root container highlights in yellow around the outside, letting us know we're dragging and dropping an item onto the root container. That gives us a label. Defaults to the name of label. If we add multiple labels, those will get incremented. So if we have two labels, we'll now see that we have label 1. We'll delete that for the time being. We just hit the delete key when it's selected, or you can right click and choose delete on the menu, and then click yes if you're sure you want to delete that component. Once we select that, we'll see our property editor change with the name of the component, which is label. We'll see it selected up here in the project browser. We'll see that it's enabled, visible. We can edit border settings if we want to put a border around that. If we want to add mouse over text for a user to hover over that or change the cursor. Then for labels, we typically have a text value. That's what the label is going to display. In this case, it says label. And a quality, if we want to tie that to tag quality or something to indicate something's wrong. Down here under appearance, we also have our font settings, our background settings, our foreground settings, and if we want to put an image in there or do any rotation or add any styles or anything. And then for layout, we also have horizontal alignment and vertical alignment options. So if we want to make this bigger, and leading is basically to the left for horizontal alignment. You also have left, center, and right, and trailing, which takes you to the right. So we'll see left is basically the same as leading. Center gives us a center aligned text. Right gives us right aligned text. And trailing also gives us right aligned text. This is useful for if you're laying out your graphics and you want to have a title bar above an image or a graphic, say you have a pump and you want to have that centered above the pump, you can use the center alignment, or you can use left alignment as needed, or right, depending on how you're laying out your screens. So that's all pretty standard text formatting things. If we want to look at the font, we click the drop down here. We can choose a different font from the list that's available of what's installed on the gateway server here. Defaults to dialog unless you change that in your project properties. We'll just change it to Arial for the time being. The size is your font size, similar to in a word processing system. Let's make that 24. And then if we want it to be bold or italic or both. And you'll get a preview of what that will look like here in the window. So if you want to make any adjustments to that, you can. We'll just leave it as 24 bold for the time being, and we'll hit OK to accept those changes. And you'll see our label text up here adjusts in size. If we want to do a background fill, we would check fill background. In this case, it would do an almost white color because that's what we have selected here. We can click the color picker and go through the different options. If you know the RGB values or a hex code, you can enter that directly. You can also pick common colors from the palette. Let's say we want a dark gray. We can choose that. And if we want to take that off, we just uncheck fill background and that goes away. A foreground color is your text color. Again, if you click the little color selector there, it'll bring up the color chooser window. Let's say we want to make it red. We'll see that that comes up in red on our text now. We'll just leave it as black for the time being. And then image path is if we want to put an image in there, we'll leave that alone for the moment. And we'll see that because our text size increased, let's exaggerate that a little bit. Let's make it 48 and hit OK. It's not showing properly in our label here. To fix that, we can simply adjust the size of our label component to whatever we want it to be using the handles. If you know specifically what you want it to be, you can also go to the component menu, size and position, and you can change your XY position. Let's say we want to put it at let's say 50 and 100 for our X and Y. And let's say we want to make it 300 by 60. Then we hit OK and it moves it to these coordinates, 50 X and 100 Y, and then change the scale to match what we have up there. Again, that's under the component menu, size and position. You'll also see the tag binding icon, which is this little chain link on each of the objects over here. Let's change our font size back to a reasonable amount. Just make it 24. 24, enter. Make it a little smaller. Typically, we're not doing a lot of binding on our colors. We'll get into how we manage that in a future video. For labels, we're commonly adjusting our text value based on a value of a tag or maybe something coming from a database. So let's say we want to bind this to a tag. So we come to the little chain link icon, we click on that, and that brings up our property binding window. We have a bunch of options here we'll get into in future videos. Let's just say we want to bind that to a tag. So we select tag in the window. we go to tags, we expand ignition 102, and let's use our string value to display. You can also use any of these other values. We'll also get into other options for display of numbers and things here in a minute. But we'll go to our string value and we'll hit OK. And now if we look at our string value tag here in the tag browser, we'll see it currently says string value. And that's what we see here in the label. If we were to edit this, say label example, and we're currently in read-only mode, which is default typically when you open a designer. For purposes of this video, we'll just enable read-write mode. That will allow us to read and write values to our tags at will. So now we updated our string value to say label example, and our text updated up here. So that's how you bind a value from a tag to a component, like the text on a label. And you can bind to it pretty much any property on a component. If you wanted to bind to font, you have to dig into the back end a little bit. But for anything with a chain link icon, you can bind to that easily. So that's pretty much all that we really deal with labels. If we want to dive into a numeric label, that's effectively the same thing as a label. That's pretty standard, but it comes with pre-formatted indications for numeric values. Again, you'll see we have our font settings, background color, and so on, just like on a label. Our text alignment settings here as well. And then we also, for a numeric label, we have a value. That would be the value that we're reading here. In this case, it's showing 0. Units is a suffix after the value. Let's say we wanted to look at gallons per minute in GPM. That will add whatever we have in units after that. We'll put a space in there so it looks a little better. If we want a suffix after that, we can add that in. And a prefix will give us some HTML values. You can also, in labels and really any text in Ignition, you can get into HTML, which we can cover in a separate video as well. It's not super complicated, but there's some things to be aware of. But you can use HTML tags to format and change your text around pretty easily. So if we were to change this from 0 to 100, we see that now we have 100 GPMs up here. And if we want to, say, bind this to a tag, we can come up here, find our tag path, and say numeric entry floating point. That's currently set to 0. Let's set it to 195.6, enter. And now that updates our value. And if these are memory tags at the moment for this video, if these were coming from a PLC or some other system, you might see these values fluctuating over time, and you would see our label here fluctuate over time based on those tag values as well. One other thing to keep in mind, as we have more components up here in the list, it's generally easier to name them something that makes sense to you rather than having label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, numeric label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. You can really do this however you want. Typically, I would do an abbreviation of the component type. So label, say, example, and label numeric. And you'll see that those update here in the project browser tree under the root container. So that'll make it easier if you're coming to a screen you haven't looked at in a while, or a screen that has a lot of components on it, to dig in and see what's going on there. So next, let's get into text entry or numeric entry. If we go over to our component palette, we have a text field and a numeric text field. That's what we'll look at here in this video. We also see other options such as spinners, formatted text, passwords, a text area if you want to enter a lot of text or enter markdown formatted text. Drop-down lists are also pretty helpful in SCADA systems, or sliders, and you can also handle language translation in Ignition pretty easily. But first, let's look at a text field and a numeric text field. So just like we did before, we will click text field and we'll drag it over. This will give us a text box. If you've used any, software for business applications, this should look pretty familiar. It defaults to text field as our name, so let's call it text entry. And this gives you a handful of parameters as well. Visible, border, mouse over text are pretty standard among components. If it's editable, meaning a user is allowed to edit this, that may be locked down based on a user's role in the system. If you defer updates, that kind of gets into some back-end functionality on when the updates take place, if they take place in real time, or if you have to press enter. And protected mode, reject updates and things. These are all kind of nitty-gritty details of how you're handling your text field. And touchscreen mode is if you're using a touchscreen, what it takes to pop up the keyboard, either no keyboard, single or double click. And then we also have similar appearance settings to our label. We'll just change this to size 24 for our font size. Press enter. And we'll just leave the rest as standard. And you also have your horizontal alignment setting here. And this is basically for a single line of text that you would be entering in the system. To make this useful, say an operator is going to use this to enter a node or a set point, we will bind our text value to the same tag as our label, this string value example tag. Now, since this is accepting user input, we will also check bidirectional. We didn't check that on the label because we're only reading whatever that value is. In this case, if we want to write back to whatever this is bound to, we check bidirectional, and that will allow this text field to write to that value once we enter a value. So now we're bound to string value. That should pop up with the same thing that's in our label. And again, we made the font bigger, so we will resize this. And if we go into design mode or preview mode, so now we'll go to preview mode. I call it play mode. We hit the play button. This is kind of similar to launching a Vision client where you can actually interact with the system. So now we have our text field selected. We'll delete the text in there and we'll type text entered and we'll press enter. And because we have bidirectional enabled, that updates the value of the string value tag that we bound to our text field. And because our label is bound to that as well, that value updates effectively in real time. Now we'll go back to design mode. We'll get into this more in another video talking more about layout. But the other thing you can do, you'll see how these are not aligned. If we want to select one object that we want to have basically be the baseline, and then select a second object that we want to align to that, we can come up here to the alignment toolbar, and we can align left, right, top, bottom, center horizontally, center vertically. We can space horizontally in a row, space vertically in a column, or we can center these components in the window. So let's click that. That'll center them within the window's bounds. We can also do vertical if we want to. And if we do left or right, top, and we'll see that it starts to align them together. We'll just hit Control Z to go back to where we were. If I want to align these centered to each other, I select what I want to be the anchor point first. That'll be what everything else aligns to. and I can click center align, and that will align them centered to one another. And let's say I want to put these closer together. I can click the space horizontally or vertical button, and I can put how much padding I want. Let's say we want 10 pixels, and that will space them and center them as well with a 10 pixel gap between them. New text fields can be used for numeric values. Typically, they're just used for text values that can include numbers, but if you want operator notes or things like that, if we have a numeric text field, that locks us down to numeric values. And we'll call this text numeric. We'll see all similar properties that we've had before on the text field. And then we also see some additional properties for the data type, as well as our font values here. Let's make this just a little bit bigger. We'll adjust the size of our component here. Let's make that smaller vertically. Now this is where things get a little bit more complicated. We have the option of integer, double, long, or floating point values. We also have a max and a min value. And then we have an integer, double, long, and float values that we can bind to on that. So right now we have integer selected. So we would bind something to value of integer. We will bind that to our numeric entry integer value, and we'll click bidirectional. And if you set up a screen and you notice that things aren't behaving the way you think they should with writing to tags, go back and check your bidirectional binding. That's a pretty common mistake I even make sometimes to this day. So now we'll see that that's bound to this numeric entry int value. Let's enter a value of 128. You'll also see that it updates all these values as well. That's just kind of a quirk of how this component works. But if we were to try to bind a floating point value to an integer tag, it'll chop off the decimal points. So typically we would kind of keep consistent through integer and float values. And those are the most common in most systems that we do. The other option we see here is the min and max. If we scroll up to behavior, we see use bounds and error on out of bounds. So that means if we want to use these bounds, let's say an operator can only enter a value from, say, 0 to 150. That will set our min and max value that they can enter. So if we go into play mode and we enter 130, no problem, our value updates. If we go above the maximum, 160, it'll give us an error that the number we entered is out of bounds. And it does not update our value in that case. We can also uncheck out of bounds, and we can try entering that again. And that will simply update to the maximum value that we can enter if we're not using error on out of bounds. And that can be really useful if an operator is trying to enter a value from 0 to 100 and they accidentally fat finger something and enter 1,000, you can prevent process issues at that point by using your error bound, or you're using the bounds and erroring on those, so that they're not, say, going from a set point of 2 to 150 if they wanted to increase it, say, from 2 to 20, but they entered 200 instead of 20. That's where error on out of bounds can come into play. And then we'll go back to design mode, and then we will copy paste. It's not working. Try click and paste. You can also Control C, Control V. And this is similar to dragging an item into the root container. We'll see the icon change to this plus sign with a cone and a cube. and we'll click where we want that to be moved or placed, and it will increment with a numeric value after that. So let's call it float. So text numeric float will come down here, and when we copy paste, it brings across all the parameters on that object. So here we will clear our integer binding. We'll click on the tag binding object and click no binding, and that removes our tag binding on the integer value. We'll come down to float. And if you know your path, you can type it in here, or in this case, we could right click on the tag, go to copy path, and instead of navigating through the tree here, we can click tag and we can just paste that in. And if we hit enter, it should update the binding. Let me do that again. Go no binding. Tag. If we hit tab instead of enter, it will populate where that is in the tree. And we click bidirectional because we want this to update the value. And let's align this with that. So we have that, our text field selected. We'll click this and align center horizontally. And now they're in line with one another. And we still see that we have 196 instead of 195.6 because we're in integer mode, so it's rounding the value. So we'll go to float mode. And that will update to match our floating point value here. Now, if we go into play mode, and let's put in 145.4. We enter 145.4, and we see our numeric display and our tag value update here in the tag browser. This is numeric entry, numeric fields. So this has our GPMs. If we wanted to display units on this, we can either use our suffix value here, and we can type in GPM, and that will allow us to enter a value and keep a suffix on there. That's useful for units. We can also change our decimal format to, let's say we only want to see, say, 1 decimal point no matter what we enter. Let's go to 88, and that will round us based on what we're entering in there. If we have 2 numbers after the decimal point, then that'll give us that value there. And then if we want to, say, disable this for some reason, we could bind to the enabled tag, and that will gray this out so we can't enter anything into that value. We can also hide it by making it invisible, and that gives us some options. If for some reason you don't want to use the suffix, then we can go to design mode. We'll copy our label that we have created up here. Let's go to label units. Let's get rid of our binding because we don't need this bound to a tag value. So we'll click the binding button, click no binding, and now we can enter GPM into that. We want to line this up with our numeric field, so we'll go to the left, and let's say that we just want to space these horizontally with a 5 pixel gap. And there we go. So that gives you a way to enter text using a text entry field. a way to view text using labels. And we can also view numbers using labels if we want. If we wanted to bind our text to our floating point value, for example, we can just edit the binding on our text field and do that. This doesn't really give us any way to control what the number looks like. So it's actually a good example of where we might use an expression binding. If we bind to a tag, it will bring over that tag path directly into our expression binding. Let's say we want to use the round function and round it to 2 decimal places. We can put that in. That will round this tag value to 2 decimal places and make it look a little bit better. Then we see a numeric entry field for integers and floating point values and numeric displays. Again, numeric displays will kind of operate similar to a label. They're just geared for numbers and give us some additional formatting parameters. And then we can use labels or suffixes on the text fields themselves to indicate things like units or any additional information we want beyond that value. And if you're navigating in your tree and you click on an object here, so let's rename this to be numeric example. It will highlight here in the pane where it exists. And we updated the other one as we did it. So these are all named in ways that make sense. You'll also see on these we have tag bindings or property or expression bindings. Depending on what type of binding it is, you'll see this icon here. You'll see label units does not have a binding because that's just a text value that we manually entered. We see the little tag icon here. That means that we have a tag binding, and this gives us an expression binding. So we can easily look through the tree to see where things are bound to what in there. And then you can click on that and you'll see what you have bound will highlight in bold and show that it's bound with this icon here. And then you just click on that to see what it's bound to. And that's good to go. So that's the basics of displaying data and entering data through your SCADA system. And next we'll dive into some more complex components that we'll need for the designer challenge. Thanks for watching.